Welcome to Frontline Dispatches on Organizing Upgrade, the show dedicated to spotlighting the most urgent left organizing and activism happening around the country and beyond for racial and economic justice and much more. You can tune in for future episodes of Frontline Dispatch every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, and 4 p.m. Pacific. My name is Gerald Lenoir, and I'm your host today. And if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please leave your comments or questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that as we go along. And if you haven't yet, give Organizing Upgrade a like and subscribe to this channel. And finally, to stay up to speed with the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade, sign up at our website and hear about our upcoming events, videos, and articles about left strategy for organizers. So let's get started. March is Women's History Month, and my guest today is someone who's lived that history. She's been a thinker and a doer in the women's movement and the racial justice movement for many decades. My good friend and co-conspirator, Linda Burnham. Linda serves as the National Research Director and Senior Advisor at the National Domestic Workers Alliance for nearly a decade. And she has been an activist, writer, and strategist focused on women's rights and racial justice since the 1960s. She co-founded the Women of Color Resource Center, where she served as the executive director for 18 years and was a leader in the Third World Women's Alliance and the Alliance Against Women's Oppression. Welcome, Linda. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Gerald. It's really good to be here.
It's good to see you. Good to be with you. So I want to talk about the recent article that you wrote for Organizing Upgrade titled Activist Roots of Black Feminist Theory. But before we do that, talk to us about your personal journey. How did you come to identify as a Black feminist and as a leftist?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that, Gerald, and thanks for the question. But I wanted first to acknowledge that today is a day of grief and sorrow in Asian communities. And if anybody had any questions about misogyny being lethal, and I'm assuming nobody on this broadcast had those questions, but those questions have been put to rest. And I was lucky enough to come up in a Black feminism that was understood its relationship to other communities. And I'm hoping and I'm trusting and knowing that young Black and brown leaders today are expressing their solidarity with Asian communities in this time of violence directed at Asian communities. So I just wanted to start with just taking a couple of breaths and a moment of quiet contemplation to acknowledge that grief and to acknowledge how far we still have to go as humans and as a nation. So let's just be quiet for a couple of minutes and take a couple of breaths. So, Gerald, thank you for giving me that time. So you asked about how I came into my activism. So I come out of a family of leftists. I'm what could be called a Black red diaper baby. So I grew up in politics, and I also came out of a really nurturing family. So I didn't resist politics. And I also came up in a time, I was growing up in the 60s, 50s and 60s. So I came up in a time when particularly liberation movements in other parts of the world were showing us a different way and showing us something about the country that we live in. And then I was, once I moved out to the West Coast, I ended up going to a demonstration around reproductive rights. And one of the women there, Atieno Davis, as a matter of fact, grabbed a bullhorn and said, well, can all the Black ladies who are here come meet under this tree? And there were not that many of us. So we met under that tree. And of course, in those days, 2-3 people, you were ready to rock and roll. And so we formed Black Sisters United. And it was first in Black Sisters United in conversation with other Black women in the Bay Area, that my feminism, that's where my feminism started, and then was developed and nurtured in the context of the Third World Women's Alliance.
All right, and you were one of the leaders in that Third World Women's Alliance, I remember, and then also in the Alliance Against Women's Oppression. So let's turn to your article, because I think some of your experience was written into this article called The Activist Roots of Black Feminist Theory. And you argue that the intersectional theory that we are used to talking about today was not born in an academic setting, but instead, you say that the wellspring of Black feminist theory is the experience and thought leadership of Black women in the early 1970s, as you referenced. Talk about what the content of that Black feminist theory was and how it came to be.
Yeah, it's a great story. Some folks know it, some folks don't. It needs to be lifted up. And I have a really deep respect for the academic community. I do want to say that. And I want to say that, this is an issue of where do ideas come from? And then how do they get developed and elaborated? So we're going back to the late 1960s. In the late 1960s, there were some women who were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And folks who don't know what that is, you'll just have to go look it up. But the women in that organization started to be in conversation with each other about the fact that they were not given the broadest scope to bring forward their skills and abilities in the context of that organization, which was at the time male dominated, as pretty much every organization was in the 1960s. And so they started a caucus. It was a Black Women's Caucus of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And just to call names, two of the people who were active in that were Frances Beale, founders, Frances Beale and Gwen Patton. And so they were in conversation about what it means to be in struggle for Black liberation and for their leadership to be overlooked or dismissed. And that conversation led to the development of the Black Women's Alliance. And in the Black Women's Alliance, the conversation about race and gender in particular took shape. Was a deep history here, but the Black Women's Alliance over time became the Third World Women's Alliance, incorporating radical Asian and first Puerto Rican, but later broader Latinas into the organization. Part of what was going on in the late 60s and 70s was what was called consciousness raising groups. And the point of consciousness raising groups was to be in conversation and those conversations were about, well, the women's liberation movement is not quite speaking to our experience. It's not quite speaking to our communities. It's not quite speaking to our needs. So what is that about? And out of those conversations, kind of the tagline of the Third World Women's Alliance became, in the lingo of that time, smash capitalism, racism, and sexism. Just smash it. And then it's also noteworthy that capitalism and imperialism, sometimes it was smash imperialism, racism, and sexism. Sometimes it was smash capitalism, racism, and sexism. Um, and that's partly because there's also a strand of the Black feminism that develops in that time that's very internationally oriented, meaning that these organizations come up in the context of the US war against the Vietnamese people. And what that means is that there's a lot of radicalism that develops that has to do with, wait, how do we get into a war in Vietnam? What are we doing in a war in Vietnam?
Mm-hmm.
And out of that comes thinking and study and conversation in these consciousness raising groups about, what is imperialism about? How does it shape the lives of people in other parts of the world? How does it shape our lives and our outlook? So, all of this is to say that what springs out of the Black feminism developed in this kind of line of descent from the Black Women's Caucus of SNCC into the Black Women's Alliance, into the Third World Women's Alliance, is a Black feminism that, number one, struggles to understand and articulate the experience of Black women, the experience of women of color, and how that experience is shaped by capitalism, economic inequities and economic exploitation, how it's shaped by sexism and patriarchy, and how it's shaped by racism and white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
So that is articulated. It's not articulated as it comes to be articulated in the academy, but I was both in conversation with Frances Beale earlier today because I wanted to see what she had to say about what I should say, and then I also took a look at some of the documents of the Third World Women's Alliance just to refresh my memory, and those articulations are pretty mature, and they come from women who were just kind of women in struggle, trying to figure out in what we believe and what we demand kind of statements. What is it that is going to advance? What is it that's going to advance the well-being of the women in our communities? I also want to so that matures in the context of organizing, day-to-day organizing, and then is taken into the academy, which is a good thing, and further developed and elaborated. And I think, what else do I have to say about this? Yeah, I just feel really, really lucky that I was raised up in a political culture of Black feminism that also opened up and out to first the experiences of other women of color. So really grounding ourselves in kind of what's the history of Asian women in this country?
Mm-hmm.
What's the history of Latinas in this country? How does that intersect and reflect the experiences of Black women, and in what ways is it distinct? So that's the Black feminism that I was raised up in.
So Linda, how did this play out in the organizing in relationship to the Black movement, in relationship to the dominant women's movement? What were some of the challenges and struggles that you had to go through to assert this Black feminism?
Wow, that's a great question. Because there's some things that are assumed now that definitely were not assumed then. There was there were definitely on the Black side men in the movement who were like, no, we're fighting for liberation. Somehow liberation got crisscrossed with manhood, and in its worst strains, women were, I mean, I know this is going to sound unbelievable, but if you look back in history, it is true. In the worst strains, it was like, well, women should be making babies for the revolution. That sounds unbelievable. I know. But I'm just saying that was a real thing. That was a real for real thing.
Yes, I
So,
remember.
so the idea of women coming into their place and into leadership and having their own opinions about stuff and having their own opinions about politics in general, and the idea that they ought to be able to lead around questions of liberation, that was highly contested. I'm just going to say it was highly contested. And I don't mean just like people writing bad things to each other. I mean, you had to fight. You had to fight for that point of view with people who didn't really want to hear it.
Yeah.
So, so that's kind of.
And what about the women's movement, the dominant white women? What kind of struggles happened within the broader women's movement?
Yeah, and let me also just say in relationship to that from many different sides, what also happens in that period, now we're talking late 60s, early 70s. This is also going to sound crazy and incredible to people. You get lesbian baited. People possibly don't even know what lesbian baited is, but it means that you get called a lesbian, which of course some people actually were, but for deciding that you figure out how to fight for women's liberation.
A man-hating lesbian, right?
You get to be a man-hating lesbian. So that's a kind of craziness, but like it's a fertile movement with people with all kinds of different opinions. So you have to fight for space. And I think in relationship to white women, there was just a way in which the experiences of women of color were, like an unknown entity. And so they just, it was like they had no framework, they had no context. I remember, now this is later on, I don't know, now we're deeper into the 70s or possibly even the 80s. Somebody wrote an article that said, this is a feminist, by the year 2000, all of the nation's poor will be women and their children. I was like, point of that being, there was the sense of what economic exploitation and oppression looked like in communities of color, the sense of what it was that African American women or Asian women or Latinas experienced in their families, in their communities, in the workplace, that just didn't exist. Yeah. So we had to create our own space to be able to have the kinds of conversations that we needed to have to define our own reality. Then what that meant was, kind of programmatically and in terms of work, it meant that, for example, reproductive rights was obviously a big thing in the late 60s. Now we're talking pre-Roe versus Wade, late 60s and early 70s. And African American women and poor women in general were most impacted by lack of access to abortion, legal abortion. And so when we develop work and thinking and politic around reproductive rights, it of course involves the access to free and legal abortion, but it also looks at sterilization abuse in Puerto Rico, in Black communities in the South, where especially, probably not only, where, doctors felt like, well, you've had 2, 3 babies, time for me to tie your tubes, whether I tell you or not. So in the context of a Third World Women's Alliance, it's not just access to abortion, but issues of sterilization abuse and later issues of the incredibly high rates of mortality in African American communities that also came on the agenda, which, by the way, that rate of infant mortality in African American communities is still way, way higher than it ought to be.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess what I'm speaking to is what that looks like programmatically when you see, what do we working towards? Free and accessible childcare for all, right? The basics of a program that would make it possible for women to work and function at home and in the workplace in ways that are reasonable and dignified.
So talk a little bit about what from that period, the theories in the activism from that period can be carried into today. I know one of the things that has been carried through is this notion of triple jeopardy that was very popular in the 60s and 70s, and now is talked about as intersectional organizing. But what is some of the theory that can be carried into today and some of the organizing themes?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all props to the brilliant young women who are carrying feminism and Black feminism in particular forward. It's really, really gratifying to see the kinds of interest in kind of lifting up the power of Black women and of women of color. And, there's their kind of baseline assumptions about women being able to step into their power that just didn't exist back then.
Yeah.
And so I see this iteration of Black feminism as in a line of continuum with Black feminism of that period that arose in the late 60s and early 70s. And of course, in a line of continuum going way, way back to people who wouldn't have called themselves feminists. We didn't call ourselves feminists at the time. But that line, goes all the way back to whatever, Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and whoever came before them and Ida B. Wells and all of the rest of it, wherein people are about stepping into their power for the liberation of their people. So to the extent that Black feminists, that's what Black feminists are about today, with a skill set and a depth of thinking that is beyond where we were back in the late 60s and early 70s, then, I'm all totally 100% for it. And I think the other thing I would say, the thing that I feel like can and should be brought forward, I guess two things that I think can and should be brought forward more intentionally. Black feminism gives us a grounding in politics, and it creates an opportunity, especially the intersectional frame, creates an opportunity to go deeper into understanding how it is that capitalism shapes who we are and even how we think.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about the ways in which, total sidebar, I've been thinking about the ways in which, our minds are more or less being colonized and manipulated by people for the sake of profit.
Yeah.
Well, there was less of that when I was coming up, just because like Google and Facebook couldn't like get in your mix and mix it up. So that's different. So there are, which is to just say that there are new challenges for Black folk, Black feminists, and humanity. And to the extent that Black feminism is broad enough for us not to only sit in what's happening for Black women in particular, but to bring us further out into the fullness of humanity and what's happening for and to humans in this moment. And what does that mean about how we organize ourselves in and for struggle? Then that Black feminism is a good thing.
There you go. So we only have a few more minutes. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. I don't see any in the chat. But Linda, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the elections, because Black women, Black community in general, but Black women in particular, really stepped up in the elections and turned the tide, if you will, in beating back proto-fascism, in turning Trump out to pasture. So talk about the role of Black women, and also the left has been really focused on what is being called an inside-outside strategy, and what the role of the Black community has been in that strategy.
Gerald, we got 2 minutes. But anyway, okay, I'm just going to say.
In 2 minutes or less.
2 minutes on that. Woo! So I'm just going to say, if somebody landed here from Mars and they said, okay, so where's the center of the progressive community in the United States? They would land up on Black women, right? And meaning, and that's, that doesn't have anything to do with melanin or anything else. That just has to do with our experience and the experience of our ancestors in the US of A. It also doesn't mean, all Black women are right all the time. We're as wrong as anybody else sometimes. But as a group, given that ancestral and current day experience, we end up in a particular political place. And the fact that those women were able to bring that forward in Georgia in the way that they did is a demonstration of that, a powerful demonstration of that, and a demonstration of something that we can build on for many years to come.
All right, Linda Burnham, I appreciate having this conversation with you. And, I have many more questions to ask, but we're out of time. I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience. If you enjoyed this video, stay up to speed with all of the amazing content coming out of Organizing Upgrade. You can sign up at our website to hear about upcoming events, videos, and articles about left organizing strategy. Thanks to all of you who joined us, and thanks to the production team. And you can join us next week at 4 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Central, and 7 p.m. at Eastern. You can stay tuned now for tonight's call for Winning the People's Agenda by our partners at the Frontline, featuring Working Families Party, Black Lives Matter, and Florida Rising. Thanks again, and thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Sorry about that mix up in terms of the end. I need to get a mouse because I've been just using my computer. Thank you so much. Linda, is there any feedback you have from us?
I guess. I don't know. I don't know what just happened, but it was fine from my end.
Great. Thank you. That was really amazing, Gerald. That was really amazing.
It was good, Linda. Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Okay.